Okay, here we are at the San Francisco International Book Fair. It's February 16th, 2013. And our next interview is with Scott DeWolfe, who is partners with Frank Wood. And they have a terrific bookshop up in Alfred, Maine, which is someplace you probably never heard of. But so why don't you just bring us up to speed, Scott? Tell us a little bit about you as a young man. Do you have siblings? What were your parents did for a living? What schools did you went to, and et cetera?
All right. I was born in central Massachusetts, outside of Worcester, in 1961. My father worked for computer companies, and my mother worked for a private boys' school. My father did antiques on the side, so that really was the start of my interest in old stuff. And specifically, we would always go to places like Fruitland's Museum in Harvard, Massachusetts, and other similar places. And that caused an interest in American Indian material, Shaker material, and other old things. My father didn't care, at least initially, about books and paper things, but I did. And by the time I was probably 12 years old, I started collecting local history. Old postcards and paper things related to the towns where I grew up and where my father had grown up. And from there I moved to American Indian artifacts and a number of other things, but always liked books and paper. And by the time I was 16, I was running an antique shop for a family friend in Milford, Massachusetts, and really started to move into selling especially old ephemera, still not very many books, but old paper things. So I have one sibling, and again, grew up in central Massachusetts, was fascinated by New England Indians, and decided to go to college for Native American studies. I made a lot of choices through my life for things that I thought would make me happy, but not necessarily make me money, and so people thought I was crazy. Going to school for Native American Studies and history in Native American Studies. But I went to a small college in northern Wisconsin called Northland College, and that's what I studied. And I also, throughout this period, had interest in American communal groups, and so my senior year in college, as I was getting ready to graduate, I wrote the Sabbathday Lake Shakers in Maine and asked them for a job in their museum. The brother who was in charge at the time of the small surviving Shaker community hired me sight unseen, and so the summer of 1984 I spent with the Shakers, and then went off to graduate school in Albany, New York for anthropology. That didn't work out, so I actually worked full-time with the Shakers for a number of years. Met my wife in graduate school, and we got married and moved permanently to Maine. And eventually, as far as education goes, I got a master's degree from University of Southern Maine in New England Studies.
So when did you start? When did you open your first book venture?
Well, I really never stopped buying and selling from the time I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I was always, even if essentially really the only job I ever had as an adult was working for the Shaker Museum at Sabbathday Lake in Maine. But even when I was there, I was buying and selling material, and also doing buying for the Shakers and building their collection. So Beth and I were married in 1987, and I think I left the Shakers in '88 and went into the business full time. And essentially, for the first few years, I specialized and almost only dealt in things related to American communal history, and then a few other books and paper items that would come along. So 1988 was when I started full time, and I met Frank when I started to work at the Shakers. He also worked for the Shakers. He was a career politician who would also when he wasn't doing political stuff, would work for the Shakers in their museum. And in the late 80s, we started doing things together. The first major thing we did is he bought Hazel and Ed Fales' collection up in New Hampshire, which was several huge truckloads of manuscripts and books.
They had a ton of stuff, didn't they?
They had huge amounts of things. I mean, piles of ephemera and letters. And Frank is an old-time bookman, and at the time didn't care about ephemera. And of course, I knew ephemera, so he brought me in. And we started doing some shows together, and it was working out well. Beth decided to go back for a PhD at BU in history, and we briefly became the curators of the Fairbanks House in Dedham, Massachusetts. And we did that for about a year to save Beth the commute into Boston. But what happened was, as soon as we took that job, my commercial building became available for rent, and Frank called me and said, well, why don't we rent this building? And the rent was so inexpensive, we decided to do it. And so I started having to commute to Maine, so she lost the commute, I gained a commute. And we opened to Wolfe and Wood in 1993, so it's almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years on April Fool's Day.
At the same location?
At the same location.
Right off the Green and Alfred.
Right in the center of town, a big 19th century country store built in 1869. It has a full-length Masonic hall on the 3rd floor. It's a great old building.
And you had like a barn or an annex to it?
We have connected sheds to on the back, yes.
Okay. Do you have a presence on the internet?
Yes, we do. We have a website. We sell on eBay. We sell on Amazon, Biblio, Abe. We issue occasional online catalogs. The way I look at the business is pieces of a puzzle. Frank is more the book person. I'm more the business person, and I like cash flow from a number of different sources in case something slows down. So we do have a fairly heavy presence on the internet.
Do you buy much on the internet?
We buy a fair amount. It would be hard to quantify, but I would say almost every week we buy something off of eBay that fits into our specific interests, like the Shakers or Maine.
Tell us a little bit about your purchase of Francis O'Brien.
Yeah, Frank is about 13 years older than I am. So Frank was in the book business starting in the 70s, and his mentor was Francis O'Brien, who was a founding member of the ABAA. And as Francis became ill and eventually passed away, he let his daughter know that we should be given first refusal on his books at his summer home. Francis had a huge home in Portland, but years ago he purchased an 18th century farm in Hiram, Maine, and there were about 150,000 books.
Wow.
In that farm, with most of them being in this huge barn, and then the remainder in the house. And initially we bought all the books in the barn, lock, stock, and barrel. Francis bought huge quantities of books, and if he couldn't deal with them in Portland, he'd haul them out to the barn,
Yep.
and he would just push them into this barn. And so it was absolutely full, and it took us a good 2 years to clean it out. And eventually we purchased all the books in the house too. So that really, other than the Fales buy, that was the start of our long tradition of buying out booksellers, which continues to this day.
Okay. Okay, let me ask you a few questions here. What booksellers, living or dead, would you consider to have been mentors or an influence on you?
Well, certainly Francis O'Brien. For me, David Newell out in Nashville, Massachusetts.
He's a Shaker guy, isn't he?
Yeah, Milt Sherman, who was a Shaker guy for me. Of course, we have done a lot of business over the years, and I always have learned a lot from your cataloging and so forth. Frank really, I think, especially like Francis O'Brien and the Fales, and also the Motts. Frank would visit the Motts every year and buy things from them. And so those were the major booksellers that influenced us.
So mostly New England people.
Mostly New England people. I mean, in more recent years, we do a lot with Ed Hoffman out in Ohio and so forth. So.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think are some of the great challenges that we face as booksellers looking into the future?
Finding a market for what we are able to obtain. I think that's the biggest problem. The market is always changing, and many of the standard things that in the last 20 years anyways, we've easily been able to sell no longer necessarily bring what they used to. So we've had to adjust our buying and selling to the changing market and look for markets that aren't always accessible to other book dealers. So, for example, we do a couple of fairly high-end antique shows where we have to decorate room settings with antiques and books, and so we try to think out of the box. For a long time, for many years, when we were first in business, we had two very good customers that did the Atlanta Scott's Antique Market, and they would come up and buy a lot of decorative stuff from us. A lot of that has disappeared today, but we still have a fairly good market for decorative things. So the market is always evolving, and clearly I think most of us in the book business are finding that more unique things like paper and ephemera and manuscripts and photographs have become easier to sell than books. But having said that, we still are able to move a fair amount of books.
You've been referred to by a number of people as a dealer's dealer.
Yeah.
Is this a moniker you enjoy having?
Yes, it's fine with us. I mean, obviously, there are times when we would like to get the most profit out of an item, but we seem to have reached this market of selling up the food chain, as it were, especially here at the ABAA fairs, because we're more comfortable doing that. Especially in the old days, were buying so many truckloads of things to keep the cash flow going and to pay for the building and pay for the employees, because we've had as many as 5 employees on the payroll. We always have enjoyed selling wholesale, but we do a fair amount with institutions and individuals.
I'm sure you do. Try to categorize your business in percentages, if you can. A percentage of business that you probably do at book fairs, the percentage of business you do out of the house, and the percentage of business you do on the internet and all forms therein.
I would say it's probably 40% internet, 40% shows, and 20% in the bookshop. We're in a rural area in Maine. Even back when the book business was different pre-internet, we had a very small walk-in trade. We would have dealers visit us, but even in the summertime, we never really did get a large group of public buyers. So today, the book fairs and the internet are probably the biggest forces.
How many book fairs do you do on an average year?
Well, now if you include the 2 antique shows we do, I think we probably do 8 or 9. There was a time when we certainly were doing 15 or more.
That's quite a lot of work and quite a lot of strain.
And these days, you see many of the same people at at least regional fair. So. And of course, a lot of the regional fairs have disappeared. So,
and they probably aren't coming back.
No.
Cheryl Needle told me that 2 years ago she did 52 shows.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, I'd rather kill myself than do 52 shows.
Well, it's hard on us physically, but it also is hard on your inventory, and if you're seeing mostly the same people.
You got to have fresh stuff.
You have to have fresh stuff every show.
If you don't, people will just cursory glance at what you have and move on. So there's always that feeling. And I noticed that you do, I don't know if it's monthly or not, but you sort of have like a little new acquisitions list that you post on the internet with anywhere from 10 to 15 items.
And that's extremely successful for
Yeah.
us. It virtually sells out almost every time we do it. For a long time, we were doing it maybe every 3 or 4 weeks. Now it's every month or two. And that's basically due to the difficulty of finding interesting things.
Well, you know, some people enjoy having a great big, huge inventory. I personally would like to have, there's a cartoon I saw once in New Yorker magazine. It shows a storefront, and there's a guy inside, and there's one book on the shelf.
Right. Well, and I'm truthfully like you in the end, but Frank is by far the far opposite. So over the years, we've had to sort of reach a mid-level without driving each other crazy, because Frank would think nothing, like when we bought Tuttle's, of buying 200,000 books.
Yeah.
And that lot, we left many books behind, a lot of their general store stock, but we moved 10 24-foot truckloads, and we're almost done with it.
A huge amount of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one section upstairs that it must have had 1,000 pamphlets in it.
Right. And we've processed it all, and we've sold most of it.
Yeah. I mean, that was a great store.
Yeah.
I used, that's one of the things I miss terribly, is the fact that you can't go through New England without saying to yourself, oh, there used to be a bookshop here,
right.
Used to be a bookshop. Oh, I remember so-and-so,
Yeah.
he used to have a shop over. They just aren't
They're not there. And
it's
again, they're not
terrible.
coming back. And,
No.
And unfortunately, even the antique group shops and things like that, you can't find books and paper anymore. And so it's hard to be on the road.
Yeah, it is. I've curtailed my travels a great deal because simply, I used to go out and bring back 20, 30 boxes of books to New England. Now I'm happy if I bring back one.
Right. Right.
Just, I'm thrilled.
And half of that might be a mistake, too, if you don't look
Yeah.
everything up before you buy it.
Well, I've always been a gut buyer, and I don't use the internet, and I look at the internet after the fact rather than
Same
before
with
the
us.
fact.
Same with us.
It's no fun doing it the other
Yeah.
way.
It's too time consuming.
Yeah. Okay, I have one more question to ask you, and I'm going to let you go. If a young person were to come up to you and say, Mr. DeWolf, I'm very interested in becoming a bookseller, what's the most important thing I need?
I would say to have a lot of patience and a passion in a particular area. I do think in some ways it's great to be a generalist, but I think one of the keys to this business is having one or two areas that you really are enthused about, that no one else has noticed or care about. And you see an opportunity and you seize it, and you go in that direction. And that gives you a baseline business, and then anything else that comes along you can deal with.
Sounds good. Thanks, Scott.
All right.
We come to the end of our time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.